Hi, it's me. Today we have yet another Canto 7 target extraction banner to go over, featuring our first Bloodfiend ID in the Barber of La Mancha land Outis, a very powerful ID for both the bleed archetype and general use. We also have the ID that's meant to be its foil, Fanghunt Honglu, a questionable ID for the Rupture archetype. Jokes aside, these IDs both offer a unique take on their respective archetypes, so let's not waste any time and jump right into it. Starting off, Honglu is yet another Rupture ID who wants enemies to be above 15 Rupture with 3 count, though he goes about it much differently than the other two that have been released so far. Before we talk about that, first we have to address his guard, which is a bit antithetical to his kit. Sure, reducing bleed potency isn't a bad effect, but if you're fighting enemies who inflict bleed anyways, you're just going to have it back when the enemy hits a guarding Honglu. The thing is, his passive allows him to inflict a lot more Rupture if he currently has bleed, so why reduce your bleed potency? 6 more Rupture infliction with any skill is a great benefit for trading a little bit of HP. Additionally, while he gets bonuses against Blood Fiends and Blood Bags, the specific gimmick isn't likely to be useful outside of Intervalo 6.5-2 or Canto 7. 10% more damage against an enemy with 10 Rupture is not going to be that noticeable in most scenarios. Slam is a 3-11 rolling blunt gluttony skill with 2 coins that can become a 3-13 if the enemy has enough Rupture. This skill inflicts a lot of Rupture when combined with the support passives of 7 Ryoshu and Warp Merceau, inflicting a grand total of 12 at the most. It's a fairly good skill for the archetype, and aside from the damage types, happens to be identical to the skill 1 of 7 Heathcliff, which is an interesting design choice, but it's generally an unoffensive skill. Bone Crusher is a 4-14 rolling blunt pride skill with 2 coins, but can become a 4-18 with all conditionals fulfilled, or a 4-20 with all conditionals fulfilled against a Blood Fiend or Blood Bag. This skill is Rupture count positive if it wins a clash, but only if the enemy doesn't reach the proper Rupture thresholds. See, unlike Cinq Merceau and Deviat Rodian, who no longer consume Rupture count after the threshold in exchange for not inflicting any Rupture, Honglu instead no longer inflicts Rupture, but just gains coin power? The result is a unit who becomes much worse in Rupture if your Rupture team is doing well at its job. Oh, and the HP healing down is pretty irrelevant on this skill. A Cheerful Hunt's End is a 4-13 rolling blunt wrath skill with 3 coins that can become a 4-19 skill with enough Rupture on the target, and a 4-22 if that target is a Blood Fiend or Blood Bag. This is actually a really good skill thanks to its final coin re-rolling if the enemy is on low enough HP, or if they have enough Rupture potency. Unfortunately, the Rupture conditional is pretty hard to hit thanks to this skill not inflicting count if the enemy already has enough Rupture. So instead, think of this skill as Shank 2, being exceptionally good for finishing off enemies or for dealing damage to broken abnormality parts. Lastly, his support passive is actually quite nice, reducing the bleed count of an ally instead of potency, which is far better at reducing damage taken. Additionally, Cinq Merceau is very likely to be the fastest ally if he's in your Rupture team, so being able to inflict some defense level down on the enemy early into a turn is actually very useful. I'd give this Honglu a C- overall in terms of Rupture ID usefulness. However, when it comes to feeling his Rupture Ego, he actually gets an A- instead. He feels both his own Lasso and Effervescent Corrosions very well, only missing the one lust needed for each, and even perfectly fuels his own Dimension Shredder. While his natural skills can end up hurting your Rupture count a lot, his Ego can do a lot to make up for it. This Honglu does do the best in a Rupture team despite his shortcomings, though having access to Shank 2 makes him a viable off-team pick for any team that has at least a decent amount of lust and gluttony generation. Other IDs that pair well with him include all the usual candidates for Rupture, especially 7 Outis and Lantern Don Quixote, who just happen to be Rupture units with lust skills. He actually pairs with Deviat Rodian quite well for the same reason, but the downside of his coin power in exchange for no Rupture infliction can really hurt a Rupture team focused on triggering her conditionals. Overall, he is still a great Rupture unit early on into a fight, and if the rest of your team can compensate for the amount of Rupture count he eats later on, he should be a very powerful ally due to his overall high clashing, a rare thing to have in Rupture. Barber of La Mancha land Outis is the first time in a while that we've gotten an ID with more than one new status effect. He lied. But seriously, she has 3 new statuses to go over, with the most important being Blood Feast. This is going to be the main gimmick of every Bloodfiend ID and serves as a communal resource for every unit currently on the field. Blood Feast increases by the amount of bleed damage that all units have taken in the current battle. Once a unit consumes Blood Feast, they gain a status effect called Blood Feast Consumed, which is self-explanatory and never decays. However, it's important that if a higher level Blood Fiend is on the field, Outis can't consume Blood Feast until after that unit does. In this case, a higher level of Blood Fiend would be a second or first Kindred. Outis' main gimmick is Blood-Tinged Scissor Blades, a status that caps at 30, raising between its 3 stages for every 10 that you have. 10 or more makes stage 2, while 20 or more makes stage 3. The in-game descriptions for this effect are a little misleading, so the way this status actually works is like this. Stage 1 effectively does nothing, though you can never drop below 1 stat once you have it. Once at stage 2 or 3, you gain 1 offense level up at turn start for every 5 Blood-Tinged Scissor Blades you have, and in stage 2 specifically, you also gain an equal amount of defense level down. Looking at the status, basically it just increases your offense level the more you have, and that's all you really need to remember about it. It also changes her sprites based on what stage you currently have, which is a neat touch for aesthetic purposes. Her last new status effect is called Sewing Target, which increases the damage you deal to the target by 0.5% for every bleed potency they have, up to 10% total. This is just the interloper but for bleed, instead of sinking, and while not complicated, a little extra damage is always appreciated. To start with, Outis' counter is a pretty decent one that can gain a lot of power based on how many scissor blades she currently has, as well as gaining power based on how much bleed she has on herself, more on that later. Inflicting bleed count on a counter is also very rare, though this Outis is pretty frail, so it's not likely to be that useful in a majority of situations. More importantly, her passive can increase her damage dealt by up to 40% based on enemy bleed and how much Blood Feast she has currently consumed. The 1 clash power against enemies with Sewing Target also helps with her relatively low clash power for a new identity, and also for focusing down the same enemy for multiple turns. The fact that it's Lust Resonance also means it's going to be very easy to activate in a bleed team. Sewing is a 3 to 11 rolling / gluttony skill with 2 coins that can become a 3 to 15 if the enemy has enough bleed. The bleed count infliction against targets with Sewing Target is actually the only way she can inflict bleed count outside of her counter, so this skill always has a use. Outis gains Blood-Tinged Scissor Blades by the amount of Blood Feast she consumes with each of her skills, with this giving a maximum of 5. However, if she fails to consume Blood Feast, she will always inflict herself with bleed, in this case 2 bleed count. While this gives her a power boost to her counter, it's actually better because it allows her to feel Blood Feast without actually needing to inflict bleed. Additionally, all of her skills give a small amount of HP back on hit upon dealing damage, effectively undoing any bleed damage she deals to herself. Scission is a 4 to 16 rolling / lust skill with 3 coins that can become a 4 to 19 if the enemy has 6 bleed. This skill can grant up to 10 Blood-Tinged Scissor Blades by itself, and can inflict quite a lot of bleed if the target has the Sewing Target effect. It also happens to be the only way she can actually inflict Sewing Target, inflicting it for the next turn on hit with the final coin. Overall, this is just a very reliable skill, and there isn't much to say about it aside from that. I'll Make You a New Dress is a 3 to 15 rolling / wrath skill with 4 coins, though it can become a 3 to 19 if the main target has enough bleed, and I say main target because this skill can notably gain attack weight, up to 2 in fact. Essentially, you consume 10 Blood-Tinged Scissor Blades for each stage of the effect above 1 that you currently have after the attack ends, which will guarantee you drop back to level 1. The caveat is that not only do you get up to 15 back from killing one of the targets, but you can also potentially increase Blood Feast by 40 when doing so. It's actually really easy to reach Blood-Tinged Scissor Blade stage 3, so gaining the 2 attack weight is never the issue. Not only that, but the final coin can hit insanely hard if your Scissor Blades are high enough, especially once you factor in the offense level up that the status gives you. As a result, this is an insanely powerful skill that is at full power, or close to it, with very little overall investment. Lastly, her support passive is at least interesting. Giving HP after a kill is not terrible, and being able to increase the amount of bleed you inflict after a kill are both pretty neat effects that have a lot of application in bleed teams. If you ever run a bleed team without Barber Outis, her support passive is a really solid boost to have. This ID really isn't much of an ego user to begin with. While she has a very useful ego for a bleed team in Yasunyata Tedrupam, she doesn't fuel it well, and neither does a bleed team overall. The ego she best fuels is actually Ebony Stem, though she doesn't even provide half of the necessary resources. It is, however, her only ego that inflicts bleed, which is thematically appropriate if nothing else. Barber Outis is at home mostly in a bleed team since it's the best way to increase Blood Feast quickly. Undoubtedly, her strongest two allies are N-Corp Faust and Ring Yi Sang. N-Faust provides SP recovery for Lust Resonance and inflicts a lot of bleed count, while Ring Yi Sang is, well, the best DPS in the game, and can also inflict a lot of bleed count himself. Rhino Merceau is also a really good ally, almost certainly going to be a great bleed unit once his Yearning Merkala ego becomes available. Not only that, but he also inflicts a pretty good amount of bleed count as well. Hook Honglu and Pirate Gregor are also both great options for support, since they can inflict a lot of bleed while providing high pierce damage, but they are both limited IDs, so there's a chance you may not have them. Pirate Gregor specifically has an additional bonus in that he can generate sloth resources, which Outis desperately needs for a lot of her ego. Red Eyes and Penitence Ryoshu is a really nice ally for bleed potency infliction and also provides HP and SP support for the team. And lastly, Devyat Rodian is currently the best Rodian in a bleed team despite not being a bleed ID. Sanguine Desire is really nice for burst damage against a single target, and her Lust skills allow for triggering Lust Resonance very often, plus she's just a really good ID to begin with. And that's about all I have to say about this new banner for Kanto 7 Part 2. You should all like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video because I like the taste of your blood. No, Kiwi, this is not a cannibalism bit. And if you want to try these IDs for yourself, feel free to add me on Limbus Company, as I have both at Uptype 4 level 50, with what I believe is their best ego equipped. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you all again soon.